Welcome to the History Quill podcast. I'm Andrew Nooks, your host and founder of the History Quill. This season, we're in the trenches with real historical fiction writers. Some are just beginning their journeys, others are a bit further along. They're all learning what it means to be a historical fiction writer. Our guests this season are all members of the History Quill. If you want to learn more about our membership, follow the link in the description of this episode. Our guest for this episode is Katherine Pandora, who is working on historical fiction inspired by science and Sherlock Holmes. Katherine's main challenge has been giving herself permission to become a writer. As we'll find out, she's been wanting to do this for a very long time and has only recently taken the leap. Let's find out what changed for her. Katherine, welcome to the History Quill podcast. So good to have you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is pretty exciting.
So your challenge has been giving yourself permission to write. Why did you feel you didn't have permission? What was stopping you?
I'd been encouraged even when I was a young person, 10 years old, 12 years, 13 years old. I had teachers who thought I wrote stories really well, but that was not something that seemed possible as a line of work. My family is working class, and they're very much of the mind that you should be doing things that are useful in the world. And writing would be more like a luxury, a leisure kind of activity. And I have to say, I didn't know anybody who wrote stories. I grew up in Los Angeles. If I'd grown up in New York City, that might have been quite different, because when I was younger, New York City was the media capital of the world. And out in California on the West Coast in Los Angeles, we had Hollywood, we had films, and it was a completely different kind of context.
I get it. So what was it like growing up and kind of getting the sense that the thing that you felt passionately about wasn't the thing you were supposed to be doing?
It was difficult and not difficult in that I'm interested in so many things. I'm not really good at specializing. That I also enjoyed pursuing science, and I enjoyed pursuing math. And I can't say I was a particularly good artist with paints or anything like that. But there's just a lot of things that I'm interested in the world. And so the fact that I was getting not instructions wouldn't be the right word. It would be just getting a subtle message that moving towards science, becoming a doctor, that those are the right things to do. And since I enjoyed science, that I just went ahead and went that route. Now, when I got to college, that was another possible turning point, because if you'd asked me, I probably didn't really want to be a doctor. And my first classes that I took classes in literature and I took classes in history, which I loved. My science classes didn't go so well my first year. And I had an advisor. The advisor said, you can major in whatever you want to. And I understood what he was trying to tell me, but in the United States, college is really expensive.
Right.
And my family didn't have a lot of resources, and they were paying for it.
It's interesting you corrected yourself and said it wasn't an instruction, but it was a subtle message you got from your environment. I think a lot of people have had that growing up in one way or another. What was the message in terms of what would happen if you did take writing seriously? What was the fear?
I think the fear was, you can say in one sense, just the idea that I wouldn't be able to support myself. That wasn't something that the people in my background could see as viable. But beyond that, I think for my family and for myself as well, I think it was also a fear of getting embarrassed if I tried it and it turned out I was really bad at it. Because with writing, there's an interior world that you're living with as you're coming up with a story and working on it. But then at a certain point, it has to go out into the world, and other people have to see it. And that's, I think, the scary moment. Thinking I'd I had given it my best, and my best wasn't good enough. And um,
I think every writer struggles with that to some degree, but it sounds like you've had a number of different influences kind of converging to hold you back from writing for a very long time. But let's just hold on that for a second, and it'd be interesting if you could explain to our listeners how your kind of your life evolved. I mean, in terms of what did you do instead? You know, once you left college, what direction did you move in?
I actually left college to go to graduate school to get a doctorate in cognitive psychology. Um, I like I liked trying to understand how people understand the world, which you can see can sort of loop back to being a writer as well. And I left after getting my master's degree, and then I left to go get a job in a magazine as an editor, an editorial assistant.
Which takes you back to writing again.
Which takes me, you can see I go back and forth, back and forth.
So it kept on coming back into your life, didn't it?
Yeah, because I actually thought I would never go back to graduate school. I was done with that. And I was going to write a novel. And so being amongst a world of writers, I thought I obviously would be a useful world to be part of. I found the pace of it after a while didn't really suit me. I like thinking things over much longer. And so I began to think, well, maybe I will go back to graduate school, and maybe I'll go join a literature program, which I didn't do. But there it is
And
again.
yeah, right. What did you do instead?
Um, I actually became part of a program that specializes in the history of science. And it was interdisciplinary, so it was history, sociology, and philosophy of science. I got my PhD, and then I became a professor who has been working for decades teaching the history of science, technology, and medicine and doing research.
So you've had a very serious academic career. How does that sit alongside writing fiction now? Do they feel like different parts of you, or is it the same instinct expressed differently? Like how have you worked that into your academic career, if at all?
I've found that in my teaching, more and more, I came to share that world with my students by telling stories, and giving them lots of paintings to look at and um, short stories by Hans Christian Andersen or a H.G. Wells novel. Uh, Movies uh, that were biopics of scientists and so forth, or Watch Mr. Wizard, which was a 1950s television show for kids. So, um, in that sense, I've been a storyteller, and it's been enormously satisfying. Initially, when I was a new professor, when I was thinking about writing my work, the image that came to mind was I really wanted to find some way to tell the past as if it was a collage. There are lots of different pieces overlapping.
It's fascinating how your storytelling instincts just kept on trying to come back into your life. So that sort of brings us more towards the present because they kept on coming in, and ultimately you've decided to stop resisting. You've started to actually write. So my question for you is, why now? What's changed in your life that's meant you're in a position to take writing seriously?
One of the big things in the context that changed was the um, development of the internet. And one of the things that I began doing about 2005 or so was I began writing a blog. Um, and the first time I the first post I published, I was terrified. Not that the entire internet world was going to find my post and read it, but it was public. Um, and in some ways, I was doing it for my students. I was taking their stories as well as my own stories and putting them together in the posts. And I began to be more comfortable with for writing for non-academic audiences. And so writing for a public world and then the people that I got to know through that began to loosen my sense that I had to stick to one way of being. And then I began finding these writing worlds out on the internet. And the one that was the most important, I was a lurker, but it was called the Republic of Pemberley, and it was a world of Austinites. And it was just this incredibly vibrant community. They'd get together and they'd watch the latest whatever television series was of a recent Austen book, and they'd chat about it. And they had all kinds of interesting things to say about the works, and they had all these interesting historical essays that they wrote, and conversations they had, and it was I felt that like that was going to be my world too. That and so that's those are really kind of the steps. And then I found out that there were fandom communities where people were writing fiction, and I found that very odd at first. But as I began to read the stories, I was astonished at how good so many of them were. And they were novel length, and some of them were the length of, a series of three Victorian length novels. And the storytelling was amazing, and the richness was amazing. And so for a long time, for several years, I just, luxuriated in reading this fiction when I guess if it hadn't existed, I would have been doing more proper scholarly things.
And you've recently become a member of the History Quill. So I wondered what made you transition to that?
Well, it felt familiar in a way. It reminded me of things like the Republic of Pemberley. It had a very warm sense about it. I mean, even though I'm lurking, I enjoy I enjoy enjoy reading the conversations. I enjoy when you have someone who's giving a master class and listening to the back and forth. And so that part of it's really important, because although I'm a novice, I still feel as if it's a community that I can be a part of. There's a range of people. There are people who are experts. There are people who are, extremely well established authors. There are people like me who are just starting out. There are people who are in between all of that. And there's something about the range of it that I find very comfortable as well.
Fantastic. I'm so glad you found that. So let's talk about your writing a little bit. And I think there are a couple of really interesting influences going on at the same time. There's the science influence, and then there's the maybe a bit of the fandom influence as well coming up. So why don't you tell our listeners what you're working on?
Well, I've got two different kinds of stories. One has to do with the scientific revolution time period and the possibilities that has for telling stories. And then the other one is a short story. There's a volume, a second volume from a group of people who have an independent book they publish with, and it's based on the original Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes stories in the 19th century and so forth, but reimaginings and artwork and so forth. And they accepted an idea that I had for a story. And so I'm writing a Sherlock Holmes story that actually places him and Watson back in the 1830s.
Fantastic. What drew you to write about Sherlock Holmes in particular?
Crime novels were my very first fandom. And I realized, oh, there are lots of people who are kind of obsessed with crime novels, and it's not just me and my peculiarities. Um, and so I've been a very avid consumer of detective fiction ever since I was a small person. Um, there are some authors that I adore who very few people know of. Edmund Crispin is one of them. He wrote sort of mid 20th century. He's a British author. But everybody knows Sherlock Holmes. And So to be a Sherlockian is to be amongst a wide other group of people who um, you don't have to explain why it is that you love the stuff because you all love it.
Absolutely. And what about your writing focus on the scientific revolution? Has your academic background had quite a strong influence on that?
That, yeah, actually is the case. There's just so much that, so many stories that I think probably the key impetus was that Galileo takes up so much oxygen in the room in terms of history, and he was extremely good at self promotion. But Johannes Kepler was the real genius, and for example, he his laws of motion discovered that planets move in ellipses, and Galileo thought they moved in circles in the same way Aristotle had thought they moved in circles. So anyway, I've always been a Kepler partisan. But there's so much that's interesting about that time period. The person who'd gathered the data that was most accurate was Tycho Brahe, and he had his own island and a castle astronomical laboratory. And then there's the fact that, when Tycho Brahe got kicked out by the new king and he had to go to Prague, and that's where he and Kepler finally caught up, Brahe kept not wanting to give Kepler his data because Kepler was a Copernican and Brahe had his own system. And then Brahe dies. And a lot of people have thought he was murdered. And the poor man has been exhumed twice in the 20th century to try to figure out what happened to him. So anyway, so there's a whole bunch of stories there, right, that are possible.
What really strikes me having this conversation with you is how much you light up when you talk about these things. Your voice takes on a different rhythm. Your face kind of lights up. You're just clearly so energized by these stories. And it made me wonder, what did postponing writing for so long cost you?
I would say probably the thing I lost the most was the ability to be part of communities that were writing stories and sharing the writing of stories, and whatever kinds of stories might have been inflected in ways that if I'd been doing this for many 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 years,
I wonder, do you regret that you didn't explore this part of yourself much sooner?
I think yes, in the sense that any time you limit exploring ways of expressing yourself, that's regrettable. Um, it's hard for, I think, lots of people to avoid being able to develop further dimensions of themselves because life is complicated and families are complicated, and um, there are bills to pay. And um, once you train yourself in certain modes, then there's also a kind of inertia as you move along, those pathways. And so I think that it's not unusual. I learned a lot from my daughter, who's an artist, and she can't help but produce art all the time. And she's learned to do sculpture, and she's learned to use oil paintings, and she's learned watercoloring, and she is now an amazing, graduated from college artist. And I learned a lot from watching her over the last 10 or 12 years be brave about trying new things, be willing over and over again to be a beginner when she does a new medium. Um, but I've just been in awe of how there's just this clear sense of, for her own sense of being in the world and identity, she needs to create art. And so I think that I've been learning that in some ways from her.
That's really inspiring. That's wonderful. If you hadn't had the structure and the support and the inspiration of those fandom communities, and now in the History Quill membership as well, what do you think would have happened to your writing?
Oh, I don't think I would have pursued it at all. I mean, one of the things about stories that are written by people in fandoms, with the Sherlockian world, for example, we are telling each other stories and being inventive and so forth. And um, it has made all the difference for me in being able to try new things. But if that hadn't existed, if the internet didn't exist, and so I never found these worlds because they didn't exist, I think I would have been farther along in my academic career because I would have written a lot more scholarly articles.
And joining something like the History Quill, it means you're taking a bet on yourself.
Yes, and the fact that it exists means that I can take a bet on myself. And people who've already taken risks ahead of me, I can learn from them too. Um, and so there's a certain amount of, I don't want to say safety in numbers, but I don't feel like I'm just jumping into the ocean and swimming off on my own.
I have one last question for you, Catherine, before we close. If you could go back and speak to your younger self, the one who didn't feel allowed to call herself a writer, what would you say?
I think I would say try to find people who write. And when I was working as an editor, I was working with journalists who were writing about, um, nonfiction. They were writing about stories about the world, but it would be to try to find a world of fiction writers and become a part of them. Um, Again, it's the idea that it's more possible to create when you're among other people who are doing similar kinds of working on similar kinds of projects.
It's incredible what can change when you're around people who take writing seriously. I'm so pleased that you've ended up where you are because I can tell how much passion you have for this, for your projects. I wish you all the best with the Sherlock Holmes story and exploring the scientific revolution in your writing. It sounds so exciting, and I can't wait to see more. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me.